Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs around the internet, including places like Zone Coverage, Cover 32, and Cold Omaha. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, are you dug out from the snow this weekend yet?
Yeah, actually, I had to dig myself out of the snow like earlier today, and it took a lot less time than I thought. It took longer to dig out. The people that were like 3 parking spots down, it took like an hour. I don't know what happened, man. But we were fine.
It's funny after like big snowstorms like this, where everyone turns into this weird version of our town, where everyone's like, "Oh, well, I can certainly help you here." Like everyone's invincible for like an afternoon. And then you don't see anybody at night because everyone's like all icing their back and being like, "Oh God, why did I try to help push that bus out of the snow?"
Right, exactly. It's like, we're all good neighbors. We've all suffered a collective trauma by living here in the winter. We're all, trauma bonded together. We need to help each other out. It's like the next day, it's like, that asshole will not shut up. I can hear them. It's 1 a.m.
It's 1 a.m. and they didn't bring me a thing of brownies for helping push their car out. What the hell? I don't. You think I enjoy pushing my snow? My snow. What the hell? My snowblower over there? No. Some people's kids. Swear to God. So, welcome to this show. Welcome to Norse Code episode 230. We have plenty of stuff to talk about. We had actually decided to tape this show, and then all of a sudden news started happening. So, maybe if we just start choosing dates to tape, news will just happen on those days.
Yeah, no, evidently.
Like that's happened twice in a row now. So again, totally fine with this. We have extensions to talk about. We also have a tender to talk about, and we're going to go all on the draft needs and the mailbag. So plenty of good content for you. But before we begin, we just want to thank everyone for listening, for sharing the show, for donating to our show, and helping keep the lights on and help keeping the Loch Ness Monster at bay. We really do appreciate it, especially in the off season. Anything that you guys feel like throwing at us, we really do appreciate, and it helps keep the show ad free, helps keep the content nice and crisp and sounding fantastic. We did get a little donation from Jake on Patreon, who says, "I'm a spirit enthusiast like yourself and was checking out some old episodes. I found out that we have the same taste in gin, with Leopold Brothers, Navy Strength, and Bar Hill." It's Old Tom gin being at the top of my list too. That said, what are your thoughts on tequila? Do you have favorites, cocktails? Thanks again, Jake. Dusty being the more of a spirit enthusiast, but I have dabbled more than my fair share in the liquor cabinet, and I actually can't drink gin anymore as a result of that. People have that like drink from college or something that like if you even like smell it, you start to gag a little bit. I hit that with gin in college. I had the worst hangover of my entire life, and it lasted 72 hours, and I was still in real rough shape after that. And that was a night of gin, and I haven't touched it since. Even the smell of it now will cause great peril. What are your thoughts on tequila?
I mean, I don't drink all that much. I don't have tons of thoughts on tequila. My girlfriend probably has tons of thoughts. I know the Patron is fake good, so I'll say that.
I do enjoy Patron. I'm more of like the 1 to 2 like drink person. So like if I end up at the bar, I'll end up with something either on the rocks or just plain, and just like sipping that for the majority of my evening. So, but I have gotten into some expensive Don Julio. There's a fairly good bar here, actually in Fargo, that you can get tequila flights. And that's fun.
Cool.
And they have a 1942 Don Julio that is delicious and far more expensive than it has any right to be. But it is quite delicious. So I do enjoy Don Julio. But if it is going to be something where I'm drinking it in a normal bar, I do end up going with the as clear of a Patron as I can. There's a blue label of that that's pretty tasty. But also about cocktails, I've gotten into something, and with the assistance of Dusty, oddly enough, I've actually gotten into a little bit of Hennessy and ginger ale, or Hennessy and ginger beer, depending on which I have available to me, and that's delicious. That is, I usually will have a drink of that after editing a show, just as a nice like end of the night thing, because it's cognac and it's delicious. It's Hennessy, so I mean, there's a baller aspect to it, but it's so good with ginger ale or with just a little bit of ginger beer on top of it.
All right.
Yeah.
So there's your recommendation. If you ever have to edit some poorly thought out show that rambles on for too long, there's the drink to recover.
Yeah. It's I haven't tried it after Vikings games, but or during Vikings games. But if you have two of those, you really don't care about much anymore. So it's not a terrible thing. So. Especially after the way our season ended. So, but again, thank you, Jake, for donating to the show. If you too would like to donate to the show, you can do so in one of two different ways. You can go to paypal.me/Norse Code, and you can donate directly to the show there. Or you can go to patreon.com/Norse Code, and you can donate there as part of a monthly subscription basis. And you can do $1, you can do $2. Usually people do $3.50. Some people choose to do more. We will appreciate anything that you are willing to help out with the show. So, again, thank you guys so much. Moving on to the content of the show, we have big news out of our defense as Eric Kendricks walked into Egan and has signed an extension for 5 years, $50 million. First question is this the right move? And is this the right amount of money for Kendricks?
I'm a little bit sort of on the fence about that, which I know, like, not having a strong take on this is like very cop out. But so in terms of cap adjusted dollars, like, I always try to adjust to new contracts for the cap environment that they were signed in. $10 million a year ranks about 11th, which is, below some linebackers that absolutely do not deserve to be paid more than Kendricks, like, Christian Kirksey, for example, who's like pretty good, but I don't think nearly as good as Kendricks, and above some linebackers that I think are comparable. So I think it is a little bit of an overpay, because I think Kendricks is he's always a player that I think can play a lot better than he does. I think that he's a really good linebacker, but would I call him a top 10 off-ball linebacker? Probably not. But I think he can become one without too much improvement. I think he's very close to that. And contracts are better if they're paying for what a player is going to be instead of what a player is. So I don't have a lot of if I think that this doesn't correctly value Kendricks at his current level of play. I don't care too much, because I think it's very, very likely that he'll hit that level of value. So for the most part, I think it's the correct move. I don't think he's done quite enough to meet those expectations, but I think it's reasonable to assume that he will. So for the most part, I think it's a pretty good contract. It's just a little high, but he's one of the better coverage linebackers. If he was a little bit better against the run, and could take on blocks a little bit better. That would kind of close a lot of the holes that he has in his game. And having Sheldon Richardson in front of him as well as Linval Joseph, maybe that's just going to clean things up anyway, and he's going to look, phenomenal next year. So for the most part, it makes sense as a move. I think Kendricks is the better linebacker between him and Barr, but I expect the Vikings to keep Barr because he has a higher ceiling, and I think he's more critical to the way the defense functions because of his ability to get out of the A gap and move to the sideline, or get through the A gap to the quarterback all in the same kind of play. So I'm kind of surprised, because it feels like it's going to be one or the other. Maybe it's not. Maybe they're going to find a way to keep him. Maybe they'll also find a way to keep Stephon Diggs. But this is important because the Vikings have a lot of critical decisions to make in 2019, and they've curbed a lot of their options with the Kirk Cousins contract. And in doing so, they ask open questions about which 3 or 4 of the 5 players that start for the Vikings that are hitting free agency in 2019 will they keep? And those players were Stephon Diggs, Eric Kendricks, Anthony Barr, Danielle Hunter, and Trey Waynes. Now that Eric Kendricks is kind of off that list, and now it's which 2 or 3 of those players do you keep on that shorter list? And I thought Kendricks would be a lower priority just because even though he's a better linebacker, his skill set is, I think, maybe a little bit more replaceable than Anthony Barr's. I guess we'll see. I think that this is, more evidence that Trey Waynes is not likely to see a second contract with the Vikings, especially if he keeps up this level of very high play. Not because he's not worth it to the Vikings, but because I think someone like Stephon Diggs is more worth it than someone like Trey Waynes, who, if the Vikings continue to find ways to develop, cornerbacks, or find cornerbacks, like in the case of Terrence Newman, then it's not going to be as big of an issue. So, we'll see. But it does indicate one clear choice of the 5 major choices they have to make.
So this was asked of you on Twitter earlier, and we can go briefly through this because there's a hilarious ending to it. But it was asked on Twitter whether or not you felt for the Vikings in their prime, Kendricks or Greenway.
Yeah. Okay. So to preface it, I've never had an issue with peak Chad Greenway. He's been a really good linebacker. He was like a top 5 linebacker when he was playing at his best between like 2008 and 2010. Those 3 years were phenomenal.
Those 3 years were fantastic. He was good at football. Yeah,
he was good at football, and he deserved to go to more Pro Bowls than he did in that time span. It was after that I was like, Greenway is no longer good at football. It's it all blew up. He's very familiar with my work now because of that article. In retrospect, I chose a great title. Holy crap!
Yeah, it's come back to be used so often, especially now that the Wild have a player named Greenway on his team who coincidentally is not good at football.
Yeah, right. Although someone was like, he actually is good at football, right? Because his high school hockey coach said, he was going to get D5 offers as a tight end. It was like a little bit of a misquote. He's supposed to be physically as good as a 5-star tight end recruit. He hasn't played football because he went to one of Minnesota's many hockey grooming schools that are not allowed to compete in the state tournament because they're like private schools for hockey. It's like they don't have a football program.
I just assume that's messed you up like a bit this year. Just seeing Greenway and seeing him and seeing Greenway on Twitter like mentioned a lot because he's been playing fairly well for the Wild. Yeah,
right. Well, I mean, he was hyped up, so there's a lot of Twitter mentions. And then he's fulfilling that hype based off of what I'm seeing on Twitter anyway.
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of accelerating things. And I'm just like, and so I've mentioned, this is kind of weird that there's like a Greenway that's like good at hockey.
This is all just part of your brand at this point.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's become so part of my brand that so I tweeted this out that like Kendricks who has not hit his peak yet, has not yet achieved the level of play that Chad Greenway has at his peak. And that's not a knock on Kendricks. Greenway was really phenomenal when he was good. And so just now, as we're recording the show, actually, Chad Greenway tweeted back at me, "Did we just have a moment?" You're going to follow me forever, man.
To the ends of the earth. That man will never unfollow you. He knows. He knows how to handle the situation. Good for Chad. And it's not like
he knows how to have a lot of fun with it, I think, which is nice.
Yeah, and it's not like, this tweet came in at this was like 9 hours ago was yours. So the fact that he took this, he actually has things going on. I like to think that all the kids are asleep. Maybe he's enjoying a Hennessy and ginger ale or something, just sitting back, relaxing. And I'll jump on Twitter. Let's see what the mentions say. Arif was complimentary today. Let us begin. So we got a couple of questions on the extension here. One is from Kyle Slaby, who asks, Kendricks extension, was it the right move to get him done first when defensive end and wide receiver values are skyrocketing?
I think that's a really good question. I'm not confident that Kendricks would have had an incredible market, right? Because he's not going to get Luke Kuechly money or Bobby Wagner money. Linebacker money gets depressed if you're not in sort of the top four as an off-ball linebacker. But defensive ends, their money is ratcheting up. We've seen the crazy numbers that wide receivers got: Allen Robinson, Jarvis Landry. And I wouldn't be surprised if Stephon Diggs, who's better than every wide receiver, I guess it depends on what you think of Allen Robinson, but I think he's better than Allen Robinson at the moment, especially Robinson coming off of a fairly big injury. If he's better than all these receivers that hit the market that are making like $15-16 million, what are you going to have to do when he hits the market and he's the best free agent receiver? And again, I think he's better than Adam Thielen. This is the best receiving duo in the NFL. I guess, you could quibble and say Antonio Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster and you'd have an argument. But the point is that, he might be the better of the two in terms of and they're coming from just having this phenomenal core. So, yeah, he's probably going to command quite a bit of money. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes for 17-18, which is that used to be Calvin Johnson money. Now it's like with that cap kind of exploding, it's not quite as impactful as the Johnson contract was for Detroit, but it's going to be big and it's going to be difficult to reel him in. And so you want to get him on a contract, I think, earlier rather than later, because I think it is more likely that he's going to improve his value than decrease his value. The only way I think he could decrease his value, because I don't think he would have a bad season if he sees the field, it's if he doesn't see the field all that often. And those injury concerns didn't actually prevent, Allen Robinson from getting a big contract anyway. So I think he'll only increase his value. So I think it makes more sense to lock down Stephon Diggs. And then kind of the same thing with Danielle Hunter. I don't know when the window opens for the Vikings legally being able to negotiate a contract extension with him is, though. So I don't know if the Vikings are potentially kind of misstepping and or, the Hunter camp is holding out. I don't quite remember when that contract negotiating window opens up for him. But yeah, it's a difficult, I guess maybe at the same time as Kendricks. So I don't know. I would say it makes more sense to lock down those two because I think both of them will increase their contract value more than Kendricks will. But that doesn't mean that the Vikings aren't working on those two contracts. If they just happen to have come to terms sooner with Kendricks, and that allowed them to sign this deal, then, fine. It's not like a mistake that Kendricks got signed or anything like that ahead of those two. It's just it kind of puts into focus that those two are going to be more difficult contracts to figure out, and hopefully you want to get it done before the end of the season because I think their value is only going to rise. So in one sense, yes, but in another sense, those don't actually really compete with each other.
No. Also from Cal Slaby, how many mugs did Arif break when he found out that his least favorite Viking is signed through 2022?
Eric Kendricks is good at football.
It's not like we re-signed Marcus Sherrills for for $68 million or something.
I mean, who's to say he's not worth that?
Well, I mean,
the Vikings, I guess. Never mind.
Yeah. Moving on to Nick Easton. Nick Easton signed his tender, and it's kind of hard to say whether or not this was because all the coverage on Vikings draft Twitter over the past several months has been offensive line. Meanwhile, Nick Easton has been playing really well, and to paraphrase a rant from Andy on Twitter, it was noticeable when Nick Easton wasn't in there. And it's not like Nick Easton hadn't been playing really well when he's been in. So, do you agree with bringing Nick Easton on for another year?
I do, especially because the restricted tender is $2 million. It's not that big.
No.
The question, and Andy asked me this question when I went on to his podcast, Purple FTW, earlier today, as of this recording. Would it have been better to get kind of a long-term deal done instead of keeping the tender open and hoping he signed it before the season? I don't think so. I think that the 1-year deal is good. And the reason for this is because I think Easton still has a lot of upside to reach. And I think at the moment, it's going to be difficult to find a better backup guard. Whether or not he's a starting guard, that would worry me if he was a starting guard for the Vikings this year. But it's going to be difficult to find a better backup guard than Easton. So it makes sense to sign him for $2 million, which is below good backup money for a guard. And he can still develop. And I think he's got potentially more upside than Danny Isidora, despite being older. And I don't think his athletic profile is necessarily better. But I do think that he does have the tools to be a really good guard, because he's had some really good moments in the NFL. It's just kind of, if he can clean up his consistency, I think he can be pretty good. But I would rather him prove that before signing him to a long-term deal. At the moment, having him on the roster is a good thing. The Vikings definitely need depth as well as starters, and not having depth, I think, is going to be a big problem because Joe Berger's retired, right? So you're kind of running out of bodies. Maybe Danny Isidora can fill in there. Maybe you can move Mike Remmers inside and have Rashad Hill play on the outside, but I think it's pretty thin without Easton, and so you need to get a starter, and I think he would replace Easton, or I guess get a starter. He would replace Berger, and then find a way to compete with Easton. But for the most part, I think it's a good move, and I think that Easton has the ability to move up, even though I don't think he played well last year. I think it's good to have him on the roster.
Yeah, it's especially in this sort of situation where offensive line depth is something we just haven't had in God knows how long. It's certainly good to have an able body back there. Maybe he's not starting all the time, but he's definitely a good backup.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen what happens, especially with the Vikings, when that depth gets tested and you don't have able-bodied backups. If your backups are only guys that can develop and not guys that you can play right away for a game and be reasonably assured that they're not going to be an accomplice to murder, we've seen what happens.
Yeah, we've seen enough turnstiles be installed on the offensive line. And for some reason, Carolina really likes our turnstiles, so good for them. So let's move on to draft needs and predictions. And actually, before we start off with this, you had a really interesting piece about the big boards. Why don't you talk a little bit about that little piece that you wrote for, I believe that was Zone Coverage.
Yeah, so every year, going all the way back to 2014, I've been collecting big boards, basically player rankings for the NFL draft from 40 different analysts, essentially. So people like Gil Brandt and Mel Kiper and Dane Brugler, but I also wanted to pay attention to a lot of the smaller draft analysts out there. So a lot of them, are my friends on Draft Twitter. I follow them, but some of them are people I'm actually not familiar with at all. But they did really well on the Huddle Report's Top 100 thing. So I figured there's a reasonable chance that they know what they're talking about. So I'll include those boards too. So I ended up getting 40 boards across the internet, and some of that were only available in like paper publications and stuff. And put them together, and I got a consensus ranking, and that's fine. But one of the interesting things about doing this for several years now, and the 2018 board is going to be released very soon. I just have to get the final couple of boards in. Is that you now have access to everyone's rankings going back to 2014, and you can test them against each other. And so that's what I did. I published the 2014 rankings last year, and that got a little bit of attention. The 2015 rankings got a lot of attention this year, which is kind of nice. But yeah, I looked at I figured out a way to automatically generate a ranking for the players, the top essentially 250 players to come from a draft class. And the ranking's not perfect. I didn't really manually change it that much. I moved Eric Flowers down a little bit. That's about it, because the ranking takes into account the number of snaps a person has played, and Eric Flowers played a lot. And it takes into account their Pro Football Reference approximate value score, which PFR does this approximate value thing. Unfortunately for offensive linemen and defensive players, I don't think is very good. So it's a small weight, but it's there. Their PFF grade, and small bonuses, which AV already does, but small bonuses for all pro appearances, Pro Bowl appearances, and then traditional statistics or not traditional statistics, but position specific statistics like how many yards you gave up in coverage if you're a cornerback or a linebacker, how many, run stuffs you got if you're, defensive tackle or, a linebacker, how many pressures you allowed if you're an offensive tackle. So all of those together I approximated a quick ranking, and some people quibble with it. I think Taylor Heineke, who's only played 9 snaps, is above Cameron Meredith, who's played 860 snaps. But for the most part, it gives us a really good ranking, especially near the top of the players in the draft. And so I compared each of those boards to that player ranking, and the difference in points, essentially, because the first pick is worth like 3,000 points, the second pick is worth like 2,600 points. I used an equation that approximates the splitting the difference between the Jimmy Johnson board and the Chase Stewart board at Football Perspective. Essentially, if you had Leonard Williams as like your number 3 guy, he ended up as number 1 in the system. So if you had Leonard Williams as your number 3 guy, that's, I think, 2,400 points or something like that. Number 1 is 3,000 points. And so I subtracted them. So that's a 600 point difference if you had Leonard Williams as number 3 and you ended up number 1. I did that for each player for each board, and I averaged out the difference across the top 100 picks. And so that gave me an approximate ranking of how good these boards were against each other. So I ranked them. I put the NFL draft in there to see is the NFL draft really efficient in allocating talent? It turns out it is. I put the consensus board in there. It's really good too, and I came up with the guys that are the best at it. And so 2 blogs that I actually don't follow all that much, but knew that their work had done well. NFL Rough Draft and NFL Draft Guru, they scored 2 of the top 3. And the other one was Dane Brugler from DraftScout.com. He used to run CBS's draft coverage. And his stuff has always been really good. They were the top 3. And then the NFL Draft is up there. And that's for the combined 2014-2015 seasons. But in 2014, I think only 4 boards beat the NFL Draft. In 2015 alone, I think 11 boards beat the NFL Draft. But in 2014-2015 combined, only 3 beat them both. What I'm really proud to say, though, is that the consensus board has consistently been as good as the NFL draft. And that involves very little actual grading of players from my end, but I'm still proud of it. It's a way to keep draft analysts accountable. It's a way for me to kind of understand, what draft rankings mean and how large of a sample size we need. Because one of the interesting things I found out is that Dane Brugler did really well with the 2015 draft. Like I said, better than almost everyone else. He was second, so he was one of the 3 that podiumed essentially. He had like the second to worst board in 2014, and this happens a lot. There's actually a negative correlation, not a hugely significant one, but a negative correlation between how you did in 2014 and how you did in 2015. I don't think this means the draft is a crapshoot or anything. I think a lot of people took that away from that, and I don't think that's fair. I think it's fair to say that small problems can create massive changes. Like, so if Kevin White was like your top player, you might be right, but he just like hasn't played in the NFL for injury reasons that you would not have fairly been able to predict. And so that really like tanks your ranking, right? So for me, it just tells me you need to get a lot of drafts to really evaluate the evaluator. And so I'm kind of excited as this continues going to sort of figure that out. And I know that for some people, this is already forced them to kind of evaluate the process, because it is a good way to get accountability. I don't want to like trash anybody's work. There's a ton of people here, even the people who rank like 41st or something like that. Like a really good friend, Kyle Krabs, at NTT Scouting, I think he ranked 41st in 2015. I talked to him about it, and I was like, well, you had Bud Dupree number 2. I don't know what to tell you. And he's like, yeah, okay. And we kind of figured out sort of what the process is, and if he consistently misses on a type of player or what he needs to do. So it's really nice to see that this, I think, improves everybody's ability to evaluate the draft. I think it also hammers in the point that it's hard to beat the NFL because the NFL can control what happens to these players, whereas the evaluator cannot. And so they'll sometimes knock a player for being, system specific. So if you've got James Daniels this year is a really good example. He can only play in his own blocking scheme. Now, for Vikings fans, that's fine. They run a primarily zone blocking scheme when Dalvin Cook is back there. But if he's in a power scheme, he's probably not going to do very well. Well, if that's the case, then you would move him down your board over someone like Frank Ragnow, who is very scheme versatile, I think, relative to other centers. Daniels may end up performing better than Ragnow if Daniels is in the right system, but he'll definitely perform worse if he's in the wrong system, whereas that's not quite true for Ragnow, who probably perform about as well as in either system. So if you're a draft analyst and you're taking a look at that, you might put Daniels lower because he's not as versatile, and I think that's a defensible decision. But an NFL team doesn't have to think about it like that. They can choose whoever they want. And this happens at every position. That's just an example. But they might have Daniels ranked higher because they do run that system, and they'll draft him higher, and then the draft analyst will be quote unquote wrong. And I think this happens a lot where I don't think it's fair to say that this draft analyst got it wrong because of information that they didn't have or control that they didn't have. But it's another way to kind of remind us that these draft analysts do a really good job breaking things down. And the fact that they're this close to the NFL without that control, without access to information about injuries and that sort of thing, I think is really impressive. And so this is kind of my evaluation of that and my homage to how difficult it is to do this year after year after year. And people always tell you when you're wrong. They very rarely tell you when you're right. And I did a little bit of that. I told a lot of people they were wrong about a bunch of stuff. But this is a good reminder that the fact that these people are this close to the NFL draft itself, I think is really cool.
It is something to worth pointing out that if somebody did miss so hard on a draft, they could just be going back to the lab and completely change the way they're evaluating people and thus having success the next year. Like, do you believe that may have had something to do with the with some of the jumps?
Yeah, I'm sure of it. I know that so the example of Kyle Krabs, I know that he's kind of reprocessed his whole system kind of independent of this project. Like he's figured out different ways to grade players and has gone back and looked at, what's gone well in his process and what hasn't gone well in his process. Good follows
always refining their work sort of thing.
Right, exactly. And so I know he already does that. I know Josh Norris, for example, is very into finding ways to do that. Like, for example, he used to not care about athleticism at all. He thought testing at the combine did not correlate very well to NFL performance. And he had his mind changed by, really good analysis by Zach Whitman, who does the Spark stuff at 3sigmaathlete.com. We've had him on the show. And, Justice Mosqueda with Force Players, he's had his mind changed and he now incorporates that more. And so everyone's process changes a little bit and, generally, hopefully for the better. And so when I get a 5-year sample, 3 years from now, and I'll get a look at a lot of these guys, it's still not going to be very fair because their process will have changed over the course of those 5 years.
So let's talk about Viking Twitter. Let's not talk about Vikings Twitter. Vikings Twitter is a silly place, and we should never go there.
Let's never do
that. No. Let's talk about Vikings draft needs real quick, because the big thing that has been mentioned has been both offensive line and some defensive ends. What are you thinking as far as our biggest priorities?
There's been a lot more talk now of not selecting an offensive lineman with that first pick. And I get it. Luke Inman, colleague at Zone Coverage, Luke's been texting me. I don't know why, for some reason he just started texting me all sorts of texts about how.
Does he ambient text you too?
Maybe.
Because ambient texts from people are awesome.
It's 2 a.m. and he's like, what if the Vikings take Gesicki? And I'm like, that's not likely. But okay, let's talk about it, I guess. It's just as exciting for him as a U up text is for someone else, right?
Probably, especially if they're in a different state.
Yeah, right. But yeah, he's been talking well, let's talk about all these alternate draft scenarios because, Rick Spielman, he hasn't really drafted an interior offensive lineman past the third round with Pat Elflein. And, or if you're the one who mentioned before that, even before that, he didn't really draft interior offensive linemen very high. 5th, 6th round picks, maybe the 4th round pick in Willie Beavers, but really a lot of 5th round picks, a lot of 6th round picks. I just don't feel it. He might be the kind of guy that just doesn't value an offensive guard in the first round. I'm like, okay, I guess. So who would they get, right? And so he's been talking about getting a cornerback, going kind of off the wall, getting a receiver. What if they get a receiver? What does that look like? So he's been talking about it a lot. I'm sure he'll bring it up when we do the Locked On Vikings podcast. We're taking over for Sam Ekstrom this week, which I'm sorry, guys.
You're already apologizing.
Yeah. But
I was just going to say, are you tired of talking into a microphone yet?
Yeah, well, so I recorded that this morning, and then I recorded the show with Andy today, and now I'm doing this now. I probably am going to get a headache after the show just because I haven't had enough water. But
like, I
about different things.
I got a headache because I got tired of listening to the sound of my own voice.
Oh, that'll never happen to me.
Oh, good for you then. Go on.
Go. I'd be happy to. But yeah, it is possible that they go in a different direction. I know we got a mailbag question about what it looks like if they grab a receiver in the third round. What if they grab one in the first round? What does that look like? Somebody asked, like, are they going to get maybe a slot guy who traditionally is maybe a little bit smaller, or are they going to get a big outside guy that might be able to win in the red zone, right? Because that was the whole point of getting Laquan Treadwell, is you get a big guy that'll win in the red zone. But now you've got two receivers that are smaller than you'd expect a feature wide receiver to be on the outside. Neither of them are very small. They're both 6 foot. But, smaller than you'd expect a feature wide receiver to be on the outside. So do you get a small slot guy to replace Jarius Wright and have good depth, or are you going to get a big red zone guy to, get you something that you don't need? Because you can always move Diggs or Thielen into the slot because they've got a lot of, familiarity with that. The answer, honestly, I don't know. I think the value maximizing option is to, if you've got two receivers of like equal value, is to get the bigger one, not because the bigger one has a higher ceiling, but because I think he fulfills a function in the Vikings offense that's not being fulfilled yet. And someone mentioned this, and maybe it's a pithy saying that's just too compelling and not actually true, but I like it. Which is that you want to build your receiving core like a basketball team. We've got like 5 different types of players. And it makes a lot of sense. You'll fulfill all these different purposes with these players. And so you could end up getting a big wide receiver. I don't see it in the first round, but if it is, it's someone like Cortland Sutton. Maybe you get a tight end, maybe like Dallas Goedert, who they had in for their top 30 visit. Maybe Mike Gesicki, who's like this athletic freak. They've gotten a lot of athletes at tight end, as people are now really happy to remind me. It's interesting, like what happens. A defensive tackle makes a lot of sense. I don't think the defensive tackle class is super deep, so they could go Taven Bryan, guy from Florida. They could go Nathan Shepard from Fort Hays State. They could go Maurice Hurst, depending on how far he falls, from Michigan. And then after that, not a ton of 3 techniques. Maybe PJ Hall, they had him in for a visit, not in the first round, but maybe in the 5th round. Dane Brugler just did, speaking of Brugler's like excellent draft forecasting in 2015, Dane Brugler just did a 7-round mock draft. And I was actually really impressed by it, not because it takes a lot of work to do 7-round mock draft. It does. But because of how much research went behind it, because I think out of I forget how many picks the Vikings have in this draft. 7? 6? Do they have 6?
I think they have 7.
I think they have 7. If they don't, they have, whatever. N-1 is the point I'm getting at. So if they had 7, 6 of the picks were people that visited the Vikings. If they had 8, 7 of the picks were the ones that visited the Vikings. By the way, everybody except the first round pick was someone who had visited the Vikings. And I'm just super impressed by the amount of detail that goes into that. So he had PJ Hall, and I think he had Lasley, the receiver from UCLA, and Matthew Thomas might have been a visit or a combine interview or something like that. Either way, really impressive stuff. Really fits the Vikings like draft profile. And this is a guy that has to cover people nationally. And so that's interesting. But what he did in that draft is he grabbed Taven Bryan in the first round, who, I mean, speaking of first round picks, I mean, the Vikings, they never met with Harrison Smith. That's everyone kind of knows that. In the second round, when they drafted Eric Kendricks, they had never met with Eric Kendricks either for a private workout or at the combine or anything like that. And Taven Bryan may be the same thing. So they grabbed him in the first round. They grabbed PJ Hall in the 5th round in this mock draft, and that's I think pretty interesting. Both of those guys have been compared to JJ Watt, which is hilarious. But maybe if you've got 2 JJ Watt comps, one JJ Watt will emerge. But yeah, that's all possible. And then you end up getting your offensive lineman. He ended up drafting, I think, Alex Kappa, who's again visited the Vikings, in I think the 5th round. And he's the kind of guy that, based off of what I saw at the Senior Bowl, has a really good shot to earn a starting job a lot quicker than you'd expect a 5th round pick to. So yeah, It's possible that they ignore offensive line in the first round and kind of move into other directions. I still don't think that's likely. I still think they want an offensive lineman in the first round.
So it actually turns out the Vikings have eight picks.
Because they've got the 3 6th-rounders, right?
Yes. Yep, they have 204th, 213, and 218. So this is obviously just as of this very moment. Trades have not happened yet or anything. And the big pick is round 1, 30th overall. So in a perfect world where they get exactly who you want, who you feel is the best player in the draft available at 30, who would the Vikings select?
In the best possible world, it's Quentin Nelson. In a realistic good world, probably Isaiah Wynn. And in an optimistic, or Connor Williams, I have a lot of regard for Connor Williams, or in an optimistic world, Billy Price. I think those are kind of the 3 I really like these pick scenarios.
What do you like most about Isaiah Wynn?
He's just so natural at the position. He plays like he was born to play offensive line, and it just sucks that he's not like 6'6", so he can play tackle. So he's played left tackle at high school for 4 years, and then at Georgia for 4 years. And I've told the story like a million times, but it just stuck out to me. And they asked him to play at right guard in Senior Bowl practices, and he didn't miss a beat. He's played on the left side for like 8 consecutive years. And then they play him at a new position with slightly different handwork and a lot different footwork. And they play him mirrored, so he can't use any of the muscle memory that he's built up. And he didn't miss a beat. He played completely naturally at right guard from snap 1. And I was super impressed by that. But beyond that, he's extremely technically sound. He's very athletic for a guard. He tested really well at the combine. He moves really well. He's a natural mover. And he's got, the kind of attitude that you want in an offensive lineman, which, I usually roll my eyes at this sort of thing because I think that people tend to overemphasize finishing and aggressiveness. And to me, it's unlikely that a lot of the football players in the draft are all as passive as a lot of people think. But that is one problem I have with Chukwuma Okorafor, the Western Michigan tackle, is that he lets people get inside of him. He doesn't attack them, even in the run game as much. Wynn does all of that. I think, he's not a perfect prospect. Otherwise, he'd be going top 5 along with Quentin Nelson. He's not as physically powerful as Nelson is or anything like that. But I really think he's a really top tier talent. So that's what I like about him, which, I don't know if you can tell, but I think he's pretty good.
It may have come across somewhere in there. As somebody who's seen more mock drafts than just about anyone on the internet, when you see the Vikings select at number 30, when you see them select just the player that just confuses you or like angers you, who's the one that you see selected on mock drafts where you just shake your head and go, "Oh God, why?"
So there's one player that when he's selected, I don't know what to do with him, and I don't hate it. And then there's one player that I think is just a terrible idea. So I'll start with the first one and keep you on suspense for the second one. James Daniels, I think, is a good player that fits the Viking scheme. And I have no idea what the Vikings do with him if they get him. Do they move Elflein to guard? You've got 3 undersized interior linemen, essentially. Elflein's really good as a center. He had a pretty decent year, and his ceiling is enormous. And I'm not as big a fan as him as Matthew Collar is, who's written these love notes essentially to Elflein talking about what the impact in the running game is when he's not on the field versus when he's on the field. And I think Elflein's got a lot of inconsistency he has to fix, but I think his upside is just enormous, and I love him, and I think he plays really well. I don't want to move that to center, and I think he's undersized, or to guard, and I think he's undersized at guard too. You've got James Daniels, who's also undersized, who also has strength issues. And the thing with Elflein is I can believe that you can, increase his strength. I don't know that you need to necessarily, but I believe that you can increase his strength in an NFL program. But I think for James Daniels, coming out of Iowa, that's the most rocked up program on the planet. people come out of there like really friggin' strong, like Brandon Sheriff and Marshall Yonda, and they've had a number of offensive linemen that are just really strong. They've got an excellent strength and conditioning program there. I mean, well, I think Greenway was like a quarterback when they recruited him. Like,
yeah,
they've got a really great strength and conditioning program. And so if a prospect comes out of a place like Iowa or Stanford or Alabama and they're just not that strong, I think they will continue to be not that strong. And so I don't think you can find a way to transition him to guard. So he's a good player. He fits what the Vikings do. If he plays at center for the Vikings, he'll do well. But I don't think it's a great value. So that one kind of confuses me. The one that really ticks me off is Colton Miller.
Colton Miller is the one that gets you.
Yeah, well, because he's bad. Like, and I think people who've kind of followed my draft analysis for a few years now they all know that I like tend to fall in love with athletes a little bit more than I should. I really like it when people test like really well and through the roof. And
you've been hurt before, but you're willing to love again.
You're right. Like I love good athletes. Like makes sense. It's, friggin' it's an athletic sport. But like, and for the Vikings, generally speaking, it's worked out really well. Danielle Hunter and I think Jerick McKinnon. Some people might say it hasn't worked out well, but I would argue that McKinnon's worked out really spectacularly. The defensive ends they tend to get, just generally speaking, Everson Griffin's phenomenal athlete, Brian Robinson, amazing athlete, Xavier Rhodes, just an incredible athlete. They tend to do pretty well. Even, a lot of people think of Eric Kendricks as like not that athletic, but that's only because he's like playing next to Anthony Barr. He's more athletic than the average linebacker. Also, Anthony Barr, by the way, worked out. But, there's a lot of athletes that don't work out in the NFL, and people are actually more familiar with that than they are kind of the other way. Because people are much more willing to talk about how, like, Darius Hayward-Bay sucks and not enough about how Julio Jones is amazing, right? But, sometimes, like, they're not good at football. Like, Moritz Behringer's, like, not good at football. He's not on a roster for a reason. And I think Colton Miller, while not as deficient in football skills as like the German import who's like not played at a college level, I don't think he's a particularly good offensive tackle. I think, his testing is historic. I think his upside is phenomenal. I think he's a really, really, really interesting 3rd or 4th round pick. But a lot of people have mocked him the first because, like, again, his testing is historic. I don't think we've seen a tackle test like that since Tyron Smith. And in some respects, he may have tested better. He jumped like 11 feet in the broad jump. That's unheard of for like 300 plus pound anythings, much less tackles. Just like incredible. But he doesn't play well on the field. He's got really messy footwork that's going to be very difficult to fix. He's too passive with his hands. He's not very technically sound with his hands. I think he misses his aiming points a little bit too often. That's the one that ticks me off the most. And then you have to move Mike Remmers to guard, where he's not as good as he is at tackle. And
so that's the one that gets your dander up more than anyone else that people seem to have either fallen in love with or think that he'd be a good quote unquote fit.
Yeah, and there's not that many draft picks this year that, if they're mocked to the Vikings, I'm like all that upset by. Like, yeah, when it's like Mike Hughes or Isaiah Oliver, I'm just like, I wouldn't draft a cornerback that high. That doesn't really make a ton of sense. Whatever.
Well, there has been some discussion about cornerbacks being picked, just not in the first round.
Right, no, for sure. And they should grab a cornerback. And I can kind of in my head justify a scenario for a cornerback. Hey, the top of the cornerback class is really astounding. Might as well kind of dip your toes into that while you can. There's a lot of depth in the guard class. If there's not a run of them in the first round, and it's like, when's the last time we talked about a run on guards in the first round? Maybe that doesn't actually happen at all, and all the mock drafts are wrong, which totally possible, right? And then you can get your guard in the second round, and maybe it's someone as good as Will Hernandez, who maybe he's not a scheme fit for the Vikings, but I'll absolutely take him in the second round or something like that. Or maybe Billy Price, maybe the pectoral tear pushes him all the way down. And then you grab a cornerback in the first, say goodbye to Trey Waynes in 2019, and maybe you have to take another cornerback in the slot or whatever, but you've got options, right? I can kind of justify it. So I don't like hate it as much as I like really dislike the Colton Miller pick. Every year, there's usually like a couple of draft picks for the Vikings that they tend to get mocked that I just don't like. And like Trey Waynes actually was one of them, but for the most part, they've kind of avoided them. I was not a huge fan of the Laquan Treadwell as a first rounder kind of talk, but at the time I didn't hate the pick, so I can't even count that. I just really wanted Michael Thomas instead. But for the most part, they've kind of avoided it. Like Cordero Patterson, I thought 29th made more sense. People were talking about him at 15 for another team, and I didn't think that made sense. But at 29th, I thought that made sense. Sharif Floyd was, at the time, I thought a phenomenal pick. He was supposed to go number 3. Xavier Rhodes, I thought, was the third best cornerback in the class behind Desmond Trufant and D. Milliner, and he went third, so I thought that made a lot of sense. So they generally avoid the players that I dislike, except for Trey Waynes in the first round. And generally there's more players that I dislike as a potential Vikings pick. This year it's really only Colton Miller, and he's not mocked all that often to the Vikings anyway.
So you're not going to be throwing anything at Rick Spielman's head when he comes out to discuss it?
I mean, like if they draft like Brett Toth in the first round, who can't even play for like 2 years because he's a graduate assistant at Army, then yeah, I'm going to be kind of pissed. But like,
at that point, the complimentary, let's say, honeydew melon from the spread ends up getting thrown at somebody.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's like people don't even like honeydew. It's a filler fruit.
Why is there always honeydew? Sorry, I've watched BoJack recently, so.
I actually read a really good article on honeydew, which what a weird thing to say, but like a week ago.
Were you in an airport? Were you stuck on a plane and the Wi-Fi was out? Why the hell did you read an article on honeydew?
I was making fun of it, and my girlfriend's like, "What's honeydew?" And I was like, "Oh, it's the other fruit. It's the not cantaloupe. That's the filler in fruit salad." And she's like, "Oh, you're talking." And so I Googled it, and she's like, "Okay, I get it." But while I was Googling it, there was this article, and it was like, "Why honeydew is underrated." And I'm like, "Well, I have to find out. Who could possibly defend honeydew?"
And it turns out Skip Bayless is now a food critic.
right. It's like this clickbait worked absolutely as intended. So I guess there's like a month out of the year where honeydew is actually like delicious. So I'm going to have to see if that's the case or if I've just been tricked by big honeydew.
I was going to say, is that the month of Smarch from the from the Simpsons calendar? Like, is that when honeydew is delicious? Nobody wants honeydew.
If I'm wrong, I'm out 30 cents? It's not expensive.
So let's jump into the draft mailbag here. Justin King says, I'm starting to like taking defense with the first pick. Thoughts on Lorenzo Carter and his fits of the Vikes, assuming we trade down here?
I don't love it. I guess it's another pick that I'm not hugely into. So yeah, congrats, I guess. As an edge rusher, I don't think he showed a lot. And he wasn't very productive at Georgia. And it's kind of difficult not to be productive in a defense with that many fantastic players. And even the guys that'll be drafted later, like Dominic Sanders, for example, really good cornerback at the college level. He's just not that productive. And a lot of people will say, he didn't get a lot of sacks, but he's asked to drop back into coverage a lot of times. And I think that's a fair argument. But even if you just take a look at per pass rushing snap, Pro Football Focus puts out this draft guide, and so you can see all of these college player stats. It's like heaven for nerds like me. I've put in all that data and I've run it, and it correlates really well to NFL performance with the 2 years of data that we have on PFF stuff. So, massive grains of salt. But on a per snap basis, he wasn't a very good rusher. And he wasn't all that great in coverage either. So I don't see him as a first round talent. Now, he did end up killing the combine. I think he tested really well. I think I mentioned that before that this is maybe the best combine we've ever seen for linebackers. Matthew Thomas is one of the most athletic linebackers that the combine has seen, along the lines of Anthony Barr and Ryan Shazier. I think he might be, as a total athletic package, more athletic than Ryan Shazier. He didn't run as fast at 40, but he did better in all the other tests. So that's like Anthony Barr, Patrick Willis territory, and he's not quite the athlete that those two are. But Ornan Burks had a really great combine. He's probably the second best athlete there, and Lorenzo Carter might be the third or fourth best athlete at linebacker, which in many classes would be the best athlete. And so there's a lot there that you can work with. But I think that if you didn't produce at what you were asked to do, at a position where athleticism generally does translate to productivity a lot quicker than it does for something like cornerback, then it's tough for me to justify it as a first round pick. Now, if it's a second round pick, I don't know if I'm totally on board, but it makes sense. And if it's a third round pick, I'm definitely on board. So yeah, I mean, I would rather they surprise you with someone like Josh Sweat, who a lot of people don't project to be in the first round, but on a per snap basis was super productive. His athleticism translates very directly into edge rushing. And he's just like kind of a more interesting story to me. In terms of like, I have no idea if he has like off-field issues. Maybe he's like a shit human or whatever, and I don't know that. But like, right. But like, he didn't see a ton of playing time, but when he did see playing time, it was like really, really good stuff. So yeah, Lorenzo Carter, I don't like that idea very much. Now, edge rusher in general, I just mentioned Josh Sweat as a possibility. I don't love that either. Like, I think that that's not an efficient use of draft resources. But the edge class is very thin this year. And so if the Vikings wanted to get in on that, it makes sense to do it early. But I think if you take a look at who the Vikings have brought in for visits, and I'm bringing this up a lot because my Purple for the Win, not Purple for the Win, my Locked On Vikings, I'm already getting them all confused. My Locked On Vikings podcast that I took over for Sam Ekstrom for today, that I'd already published, talked a lot about prospect visits. And for the Vikings, it tends to correlate pretty highly. I think like half of the prospects they've drafted over the past 4 years have visited the facility, much less had some sort of conversation with at the Combine or the Senior Bowl, the East-West Shrine Game or something like that. Like they really value these guys. A lot of the undrafted free agents come from prospect visits too. But if you take a look at the prospect visits at edge rusher, it's a bunch of, I think Lorenzo Carter actually may have been one of them. So maybe it's not fair to say that it's not just third rounders, but it's a bunch of, mid rounders. So Kamoku Toure, is somebody I've had, my eye on ever since, and actually Kyle Krabs, the guy with the worst sport in 2015, turned me on to. I think Toure is a really phenomenal talent, but he's been injured like all the time. But he's supposed to be a pretty good athlete. Unfortunately, his pro day numbers are like private because he had to hold like a private workout for some reason. But Kylie Fitz from Utah, a really excellent athlete at the edge position. He's supposed to go somewhere in the mid rounds. Marquise Haynes, a pretty good athlete, also with a lot of flexibility, like Toure. He's supposed to go in the middle round. So it seems like they're going to go for an edge rusher. But I think in terms of efficiently using the draft resources, I think it makes more sense to take care of sort of your primary needs, unless your primary needs cannot be taken care of in an effective fashion in the first round. And I think that those primary needs are offensive tackle or guard, depending on sort of where you put Mike Remmers, and maybe defensive tackle because you're going to need him next year. For a defensive end, I don't think you're going to need one for a couple of years, and you also do have Tashawn Bauer and Stephen Weatherly to compete, and that's pretty good depth, and maybe one of those can turn into a starter. So I don't think it's as critical. So I don't like that idea as much.
So I guess back to his original question about Lorenzo Carter, would you consider Lorenzo Carter to be the honeydew of picks in the first round?
If you get him at the right time, yeah, he should be good. What, the third round? That's what I'm saying.
Just that's like 2 week window.
Right.
Lorenzo Carter is gonna be the best draft pick we ever had in like a 2 week window. Ojibwe Pun asks, to predict Spielman priority / trading down, how deep is this draft at tight end, defensive tackle, guard, any clear tiers?
It's pretty deep at guard, but I think like the last draft that I thought was deep at guard, all of the guards that went in the middle rounds ended up sucking. So like, I guess take that into consideration when I say that it's deep at guard. Because I think that was the one where I was like really geeked that they got the guy from Stanford. What's his name? Because I can only think of Jonathan Martin. That's not David Yankee. That's it. And I was like, they could have gotten Instead of that, they could have gotten Xavier Suafilo, who went in the second or third round, or there were like a couple of guards in that draft that I like had my eye on that I thought were like really good. I think there's this guy from Baylor I thought was really good too. But they all sucked. So, take that, into consideration. But it's a super deep draft class at cornerback, really difficult to separate out those guys in the middle. And Luke loves this cornerback class. He thinks it's like one of the deepest we've seen.
He ambient tweets you about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. At tight end, it's not as deep. It's two guys and one of those guys can't block. So it's Dallas Goedert, who's like an all around tight end, Mike Gesicki, who's like this really good athlete. I don't love Hayden Hurst. He's a guy that people talk as a potential second round pick. I kind of like Mark Andrews, who people talk as a second round pick, super productive. Also, not a great blocker. And then after that, it's just like, it's not a ton. Like if they had better been able to take advantage of the tight end draft last year, and instead of Bucky Hodges, who I thought was a great pick, so it's not like I would have done better, but instead of Bucky Hodges had gotten George Kittle, who I liked a lot too, they would have been set to take the better tight end in one of the deeper tight end classes we've ever seen. But it's a pretty thin class at tight end. At defensive tackle, it's not super deep. Tim Settle and Andrew Brand are probably going to fall, and they've, I think, got some talent, but especially at 3 technique, I don't really like a lot of those guys. Both, North Carolina State tackles, BJ Hill and Justin Jones are really both more run stuffers, even though they both played at the same time. And one of them, by virtue of playing at the same time, had to play the 3 technique position. I think they're both better suited at nose tackle. You go down the draft, maybe PJ Hall, but like it's not a super deep class at defensive tackle. Linebacker, I think, is pretty deep. That's kind of the shape of that draft. Did I miss any of the positions that they mentioned?
I don't think so, actually. I think we're good there. Do you think about anything as far as corners in like super late rounds?
It depends on how these corners go. It's difficult to tell when slot corners will go. I remember, slot corners, it's just very difficult to predict where they go, like Leon McFadden, Corn Elder, which is just an amazing name. They tend to just go at like random times. And so like Duke Dawson, who I think is projected to go in the 3rd round, they could be a really good slot corner. He could go in the 5th round. Like, who knows? MJ Stewart from North Carolina, can play on the outside or in the slot. He could go in the 3rd round or the 5th round. Those are guys that I kind of like. Now, if you take a look at, there's not a ton of corners that actually fit what the Vikings like typically do, which you might be able to throw that out, for the slot. But if you take a look at, which corners kind of fit what they do, and also look at sort of the mid to late round guys, you've got people like, let me pull this over, Dante Jackson at Louisiana State. Some people think of him as a 2nd rounder or even a 1st rounder because he ran a 4.32. Some people have him as a 5th rounder because he's not been that good. So both, I think, interesting reasons for where he is. Tony Brown from Alabama. Somehow ended up weighing 199 at the combine. I think his natural weight is closer to like 177. He looks like matchsticks in a uniform. So if he doesn't like break in half, he's played really well, actually.
So he's a durable matchstick.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's it's kind of like a Marvin Harrison situation where it's like, I don't know how this is all kind of worked out, but it has.
Like how he hasn't turned to dust from any of these hits, we don't know yet.
Yeah. But the fact that he weighed 199 and at the combine and like a 4.35. He's been
drinking milk. He's been drinking milk and staring at himself longingly in the mirror.
It's got to be it.
That has to be it.
They brought in Devontae Harris from Illinois State. He's expected to go later or completely undrafted. He's kind of interesting as a slot guy. Avonte Maddox from Pitt. Kind of interesting. The guy I'm probably going to focus on is Tony Brown, because if he can run at that, if he can run that fast at that weight, that's really good for him. He had a really terrible vertical, but like every other workout looked really good. So he's kind of an interesting athlete profile to look at. And out of the later round guys that fit the Vikings kind of requirements, where they want guys who have a good broad jump, they want guys who ran really fast, which he definitely did. He's an interesting kind of mid to late round guy that had success on the field, is a really good athlete, and is not currently regarded as a first round pick or whatever.
And Zimmer kind of has a type as far as corners go too.
Yeah, for sure. He doesn't really mind if they're kind of stiff in the hips and don't have a lot of agility. Tony Brown does have a lot of agility, by the way. He really does like guys who play physical, which he does somehow, not sure how. But he really likes guys that can play physical, especially against the run. You see that with Trey Waynes and Xavier Rhodes, and you saw that a little bit with Mac Alexander. He likes guys with a ton of confidence, which is a really important part of playing the position, and guys that can play in complicated systems. And so Trey Waynes, when he was coming out of Michigan State, it was a cover 4 system that had a bunch of check reads where he had to figure out sort of what the inside receiver was doing before he figured out what he was doing on the outside. The Alabama system is the one that Zimmer modeled his coverage off of, so not a huge transition for Tony Brown. So I think, from the perspective of what he looks for in a cornerback historically, schematically, mentally, and now physically, I think he probably fits. He's not 6 feet. He's like 5'11" and change. So he's not going to be considered an outside guy, but that's, a guy that they might consider. And again, they did bring in the Illinois State cornerback, Devontae Harris.
Well, that's going to be it for draft stuff. Let's take a look at the mailbag and start off with Adam West, who asks, what kind of season would Diggs need to put up to drastically increase the price of extending him from where he's at right now?
Even the same season where he ends up doing really well at the beginning of the season, misses a couple of games, and then kind of just, I'm not going to say limps across the finish line, but doesn't quite accomplish what he did at the beginning of the season. I think even that would improve his total numbers, just because he's a really talented receiver, and what he puts on film is really tremendous stuff. That said, it wouldn't improve his contract numbers really substantially. So in a substantial way, if he cracks 1,000, plays all 16 games, and is a substantial percentage of the team's passing offense after cracking 1,000, that all would really substantially, I think, improve his numbers. And then what would really crank his numbers is 1,300 yards. That, I think, would be kind of the thing that sets off a free agency bidding war for him. As for touchdowns, I think he will continue to score, I think, more touchdowns per opportunity than Adam Thielen. And I would say at the very low end and kind of unlikely low would be 4 touchdowns, and he'd be closer to 6, 7, or 8. And if he does 6, 7, or 8 touchdowns, he absolutely will be in play for a really big contract, and bigger, I think, than Allen Robinson or Sammy Watkins or Jarvis Landry.
That would be quite the it would end up being quite the bidding war, because good wide receivers like this that are just about to enter their prime are just going to get a Brinks truck backed up to them. Just looking at his stats from the last 3 years, he has not played in 16 games. The most games he has ever played in the season was last year, where he played 14. He has had 720, 903, and 849 yards. That was last year, and had 8 touchdowns. So that's a pretty solid stat line. But if the expectation is to go full Antonio Brown, I mean, the man would end up making a ridiculous amount of money, which would put the Vikings in a bit of a difficult situation.
Yeah, I mean, the Vikings have, like we mentioned earlier in the episode, a lot of contracts. They've got 4 now with Eric Kendricks signed 4 contracts coming up in 2019. Diggs having a really good season would put the Vikings in a really difficult bind, which is kind of always the case for teams. But with that contract crunch specifically for the Vikings, they've got all of these contracts kind of converging. And some of them they can kind of put off with an option or something like that. But that would make it, I think, uniquely difficult for the Vikings. I think that Diggs should be one of the players that prioritize, but it's difficult to say, what does that mean? Does that mean they deprioritize Anthony Barr? Does that mean they deprioritize Trey Waynes? For me, yes. Does that mean they deprioritize Danielle Hunter? No, but your priority should be 3 of these 4 guys. It's a difficult statement to make.
Let's take a look at something real quick as far as kind of Thielen versus Diggs. Connor on Twitter first asks, barring a Hunter extension, do you think Spielman digs his way out of cap trouble?
Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, the Vikings have been really, really good about getting out of cap trouble. I have no idea what the solution is. I am almost as certain that the Vikings have it. Like they've got some cap wizardry going on. They might even do a really delicate balancing act where each player takes up a significant cap hit on one specific year, where the averages don't look like they work out, but the way the cap is accounted for, it does.
Yeah,
so I would be
stacking them. Yeah.
Yeah.
All jokes aside, what fantasy football implications do you see Kirk having on Vikings offensive players, especially in regards to Thielen versus Diggs?
I mean, yeah, I think it would improve things. I mean, it's not just because Kirk has thrown for 4,000 yards, I think in 3 consecutive seasons is the thing people keep saying. But I think he's a more stable quarterback whose tendencies for a fantasy football player are relatively predictable. And obviously that creates issues on the back end if you're, a coach and you're scheming against Cousins. But really what ends up happening is that Cousins tends to target, receivers that are open. And for his career, that's very often been tight ends because he's had really good tight ends, Jordan Reed and Vernon Davis. For the Vikings, I think that'll be, Thielen and Diggs. I think that he's a more stable quarterback to try and predict. I think Keenum was kind of wild in one direction or the other in terms of fantasy football. And I think for Cousins, even with Dalvin Cook there, to kind of take the load off in the running game, and even with Zimmer maybe potentially wanting to kind of crank down on the pace of the offense, and maybe even passing the ball less, I think we'll still see more stable week-to-week totals, which if you're not a best ball fantasy player is a really good thing. Now, if you are a best ball fantasy player, it's probably still going to be better, but it's not going to be as interesting as a more volatile quarterback.
Let's pull the next question, and that's from Kenneth Allen, who asks, who else can we expect to see extended this offseason, and for what approximate price?
I mean, that's tough. I don't know. I don't know who the Vikings are prioritizing. I would probably sign Diggs because I think the offense has more to lose by losing Diggs than they do by losing either Barr, who again I love and I think is really important to the structure of the defense, or Hunter, who I think has got sky high potential. I think that obviously it does suck to lose one of those two, right?
This is basically which one of your thumbs do you want to lose? Right,
exactly. And I think Diggs is more vital given the relative talent around on that offense and the stacked receiving core. I don't think Adam Thielen is bad or anything like that. But I think that the Vikings have more to lose, especially with the state of their offensive line, by losing a piece on offense than they do by losing a piece on defense, where they've got Pro Bowlers at every level of the defense. So I would imagine Diggs is the next one to get an extension if any more people get an extension this offseason.
Yeah. It would make sense to me anyway. Luke Braun has 2 questions. First, so the middle linebacker is supposed to be the quarterback of the defense, but if I understand correctly, Barr wears the green dot. If Barr were to leave for some reason, who would wear the green dot, and how would you feel good about it?
It would be Kendricks, and I'd feel great about it. I think Barr wears the green dot because he's been in the offense a year longer, honestly. I think because Kendricks made a lot of the defensive calls at UCLA when the two of them were together. And Kendricks has got tremendous instincts for reading how offenses operate. I think it would be Kendricks. And I think Kendricks did end up making defensive calls in situations where Barr was injured. So that's also not too surprising.
Yeah. Also, from Luke Braun, are the Texans good for signing Joe Webb or bad for being owned by an outwardly racist individual that seems angry about the fact that he was born after the abolition of slavery? I feel like Luke Braun should also include the phrase, please show your work.
I guess net bad. I like Joe Webb a lot. I don't know if I'm willing to take the racism bullet for him.
Well, that's a special kind of friendship. That sort of friendship is the sort of thing that you and Chad Greenway have, but you're just not that close. You just haven't had that moment with Joe Webb.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Watching him walk back that apology again, just like, really? That's
astonishing. What are you doing?
Like, he hasn't done anything outwardly like illegal that would cause the league to say that you can't own a team, but seriously, dude, it.
Right, well, it's also very how close can I get to the Donald Sterling line without crossing it?
Yeah, that's the thing, is that he wants to walk that line. He's just not outwardly using the N-word with in regards to players. It's just, man, you apologize. Yeah, you apologize for the apology that you put out. That was the one thing that was your one regret of that whole situation. I like how I'm the one who's going off on this and not you, because I know this was asked specifically for you in the wide left world. But next question is from Anthony Krepp, who asks, who among our former quarterbacks, Bridgewater, Keenum, and Bradford, is set up to be the most successful on their new team?
So between Keenum, Bridgewater, and Bradford, I would say Keenum, right? He's got a great receiving core with Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas. They've got a functional offensive line, it's not the Cardinals' offensive line. And I would say, the front office isn't great, but it's not dysfunctional as
it's not the Jets.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna push that off onto the many people say category, but yeah, it's not the
Jets. let's just be honest at this point. No, at least it's not the Jets. And Arizona, which, boy, it had all these prospects. I can't wait to see what happens with their draft, but just Arizona fell off a cliff really, really quickly.
And Palmer DeLomed, and I can make up for it, right? So,
well, that was the end of that. Next question is from John Belk, who asks, it seems like Arif's just released big board analysis for 2015 gives even more support to the idea that the only way to consistently get ahead in the draft is to exploit the difference between perceived value, i.e. the Johnson chart, and actual value, the Stewart chart for high picks.
So the question is referring to the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, which is the traditional trade chart that teams use when trying to determine whether or not we should trade the second for this third and fifth and whatever. And the trade chart put together using the approximate value numbers from Pro Football Reference by Chase Stewart at Football Perspective, which is a much more trade back or trade down friendly chart. And there are instances where trading up is good value and stuff like that. But the Jimmy Johnson chart values high picks more than this chart does because it's based off of historical data, whereas the Jimmy Johnson chart is based off of kind of how good of an evaluator do you think you are, essentially. And so if you were a GM that was pretty profoundly realistic in your drafting abilities, and you thought that you should bake in a lot of uncertainty into the way that you do drafting analysis. And I think that that's a really smart way to do it, but you don't really get to the GM position without being pretty confident about stuff. Then yeah, you should trade down a little bit more often and give yourself a couple more shots, even though objectively you are much more likely to get a lesser player. I do think that there are a lot of situations though where that doesn't fit, even though the difference between the two charts implies particular trade outcomes. I think that there's evidence that indicates that a roster full of stars and role players does better than a roster full of players that are in between. And so that variance, which essentially allows you to pick and choose how you're going to play and use your strengths as strengths, does tend to produce better outcomes, I think, in the NFL. And so there are instances where if you're happy with the way that your roster is kind of constructed, that you should take a hit in your trade value by the Stewart chart or the football perspective chart, and you give up a little bit of value in order to get a star player, if you're, again, confident in your evaluation ability. But yeah, no, I think that for the most part, most general managers make mistakes that is evidenced by the way Football Perspective has put together that chart. And it's very similar to, a lot of people saw a trade chart put up by the Harvard Sports Analysis Collective or Analytics Collective or whatever they want to call themselves, some communist name. But I think Chase Stewart did it first, and I just want to give him credit for that because it's very much, I think, piggybacking off of his work. But it's a very similar chart. So yeah, I think that teams should be more willing to do that kind of stuff until they move off of the Jimmy Johnson trade chart and people kind of trade more realistic values that are in line with the Chase Stewart chart. But I don't think that that's a very good general rule. And then you also have to remember that these are averages and no one thinks of themselves as a below average GM. And so if you are perfect at evaluation, which I don't think any GM thinks that they are, but I think they all think they're pretty good. But if you're perfect at evaluation, the Jimmy Johnson chart makes way more sense. But if you're not, if you're average and if your variance in terms of your ability to evaluate is the same as the rest of the NFL put together, then you should absolutely use the Stewart chart. And if you're below average, which is not a thing that you'll think about yourself, but if you're below average, you should discount top picks even more than that. You should trade down a lot, get a bunch of third round picks. I don't think you should trade out of the fourth into the fifth, sixth, and seventh for a ton of picks because, I mean, those picks don't tend to turn into starters, but you get a lot of starters in the third round. The only exceptions to me are a quarterback and receiver, and I guess maybe offensive tackle. I don't know. I think that's changed a little bit over the years.
So next question is from William Bodke, who has quite the long question here, but follow with us if you can. Now that we've signed Kirk Cousins, it's been an interesting read. It's been interesting to read about his football nerdiness. SI just put out a nice little article kind of going all over that. His traits seem to be a perfect match for John DeFilippo, who is a preparation fanatic. This leads me to two questions. Do you think that John DeFilippo accepted the Vikings job because it was understood that they would sign fellow nerd Kirk Cousins? And two, in general, do most NFL coaches prefer nerdy quarterbacks, or do they stay away from them? Nerdy quarterbacks might grasp complicated game plans more quickly than others, but they might also annoy coaches who do not like to have their plays questioned.
That's a really good question, and I say that because I don't quite know the answer. It probably is really dependent on the coach. I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, Bill O'Brien, was a little bit more into quarterbacks that I guess you'd say play by instinct and are not as nerdy. Let's call them Brett Favre's in order to be generous. And I would think that someone like Chip Kelly, if he was in the NFL, would prefer a nerdy quarterback, say Marcus Mariota, right? I think Pete Carroll loves those nerdy quarterbacks, which, I mean, it's Russell Wilson, right? Like, he's a dork king among quarterbacks. So yeah, and there are instances where I think that clashes. I think that there's some tension with Mike McCarthy and Aaron Rodgers, and whether or not you believe those rumors that there's tension now between him and the front office and all that. I think there's always been tension between him and Mike McCarthy, and that can work. It worked for the Packers at least once, but it's better to have a Belichick Brady situation. But yeah, I think some coaches absolutely prefer quarterbacks that are a little bit more instinctive, a little less geeked out about playing quarterback, and much more into just playing football. If you understand what I mean when I say that. I think that we're moving more towards coaches that prefer quarterbacks that push back and that are nerds and request their own offices. And by the way, so we're going to put the Sports Illustrated link in the show notes. I read it. It's kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. But the thing that stuck out to me most is not a very important takeaway, but it's the thing that stuck with me is that Kirk Cousins' office was tiny. He basically had like a broom closet in Washington. Right, he had a broom closet, but like not even like a corporate grade broom closet. Like like a lot of corporations, their broom closets are just bigger because they have to hold like equipment for the custodians. His was like a broom closet that you'd find like in an office suite that they rent out to. It's just awful.
It would be the sort of closet that you would expect that they would only put the vacuum inside of. Nothing else fits in there. It's just made to like hold the vacuum.
Right, exactly. Like why? He's your quarterback. So the thing is, of course, that quarterbacks generally do not have offices, and he wanted like, and it's super dorky, but he was like, I treat it like a business. I want to like get to work, and honestly, not a bad idea. I think it actually kind of makes a lot of sense. But the point is that it's not a very usual request. So I understand why they like initially may not have had a great facility for it. But like, the Washington Redskins are one of the most money flush organizations in the NFL, right? Like they're just behind the Dallas Cowboys. Like they've got you just build a wing. It doesn't matter. He's your quarterback. But the second, like you can't move a guy. Like he doesn't have to work in the sales building, right? So you don't have to move any of your sales guys or anything like that. But I mean, like, have you seen Bruce Allen's office? It's a suite. It's bigger than like my house was before I moved out. Like it's huge. You could like hold out during an apocalypse in there. It's enormous. And like Kirk Cousins' office was like, you couldn't fit a big screen TV in there. Like it's nuts. It's smaller than most like lower management office spaces, like in cubicle farms. So I don't know why we spent so much time talking about it, but it stuck out to me.
So while we're talking about the Redskins organization, did you see on Reddit today the message on Redskins Reddit about the letter to Dan Snyder?
No.
Okay. So I'll let the audience know, and I'll send you the picture. So what happened was the article on the Redskins Reddit said that on December 1st of 2017, I wrote a letter to Dan Snyder imploring him to do everything in his power to keep Kirk Cousins. Yesterday, I got a FedEx containing only an autographed picture of Dan himself.
So the question is this just a fact of them not getting around to their mail and then just sending out like all the old mail, just sending out like a form, or is this a substantially interesting form of pettiness?
I can't decide. I'm stuck between like, this is one of the better troll jobs in the history of like fan interaction, or this is just some intern answering all of like the hate mail. And just our standard practice here for the Washington Redskins football organization is to send a signed copy of our president, of our owner, in a suit that is not tailored. Like, it still looks awkward on him.
It does. I didn't even consider that. I mean, he's standing awkwardly too. It's kind of like that picture of Klay Thompson for the Warriors.
Oh yeah.
It's like, dude, how do you not know how to take a picture?
This is I can't decide if this is like the most petty thing on the planet or if it's just amazing. One of the comments in the Redskins Reddit was, so Dan, what the hell do we do with all these Keep Kirk letters? Send them autographed pictures. Of who? Colt McCoy? No. Of me.
Of the most important person in this organization. Me.
That is too good. I appreciate that far too much. Next question is from Don from Ohio, who asks, is there any reason at all to watch a live baseball game in sub 40 degree temperatures at the beginning of the season? No.
I mean,
is it the only one you're going to go to all year? Because if so, yes.
Yeah, I get my instinct is no, but like getting drunk in the cold is fun, and baseball games more than any other sport are about getting drunk outside. So it's but like, so the best reason is to prove that baseball should be played outdoors. You just buy the spite ticket and just go. Yeah, I guess you don't have to go because they'll count it. But buy the Spite ticket and just prove that baseball should always be played outside.
Pull up StubHub. This will be the one time that you'll be able to, like, well, I don't know. Did you see what it looked like at the White Sox game the other day when like only 900 people showed up? So like you get your ticket in the 30th row or whatever and just mosey on down to the front. If you've ever wanted to get, you only go to a sub 40 degree temperature ball game if you really want to foul ball. Like it's like you've got the market cornered. It's you and like 3 other guys.
That's great.
That is why you go. Also, if Captain America dies in Infinity War, which this is not a spoiler, it has not been released. There's no information on the internet saying this happens. But if Captain America dies in Infinity War, does Arif retire his Captain America T-shirt?
Oh, no. Especially because, like, obviously in that case, Falcon takes over. There's still going to be a Captain America, right? Like, I guess you could say Bucky Brooks should, but he won't. It'll be the black guy. Yeah, I mean, no, I'll still wear the shirt. Sorry, you're out of luck. I'm wearing the shirt.
Don from Ohio just doesn't want anyone to be happy. Ted Glover asks, what will Arif's next contract with zone coverage look like? Will he get a fully guaranteed deal, or does he want to be the highest paid blogger, or will he take the hometown discount?
No comment.
No comment.
No, it should be more interesting and passive aggressive. I'm in talks with my agent currently about these kinds of questions, and I love being a member of the zone coverage organization, and hopefully they love me just as much and that they can show that.
Also, Arif demands to be put in the room when they are making personnel decisions. Otherwise, he's not going to talk to his family like Aaron Rodgers doesn't talk to his. He's very fragile, very touchy. May have gone too far there, but we're going to move on to Kyle Slaby's question, which is, was Daryl Worley deep down a criminal when he was traded, or was that just a bad reaction to the Philadelphia air? Can anyone truly have pure moral agency in Philly?
Excellent question. Does Philly make people worse? The evidence that we have is it leans in a particular direction. I'm not going to say which direction, but I do want to point out that from a community and social perspective, I really respect what a lot of their players do off the field. People like Malcolm Jenkins, people like Chris Long. There's a lot of players on that team that are like that. So, maybe, but we do have really good counterexamples. So that's all I'm going to put out into the universe on that question.
there's a lot of there's a lot of very public examples of when this stuff goes wrong.
Right.
Also from Kyle Slaby, based on the recent storm and the week to come, Green Bay had its largest snowfall in 130 years. Is it safe to assume that the Song of Ice and Fire takes place in the future Earth? 2018 is the first of the multi-year winters. So basically, is Game of Thrones happening right now, and are we looking at multiple years of winter?
Yes.
Eventually spring has to happen. Like, regardless of the fact that it wants to dump 1.5 feet of snow on you, eventually spring kind of has to happen. They haven't canceled actually, I think the only time I can ever remember spring not happening was the flood of 97. And I think that's just because by the time we made it back to our homes, it was summer. Like I
was actually singing in my head earlier today, the Big Flood. I don't know how, but I was like, oh, I remember that song. That's crazy. So for people who are not from Grand Forks, the vanishingly small number of you that are somehow not from the bustling metropolis that's Grand Forks, North Dakota, They had like a 250-year, 500-year flood in 1997. It was enormous. It had international headlines. We were all essentially refugees. I moved from like home to home from like South Dakota, Fargo, in California for a second.
This was the big flood that had the big fire in the middle of downtown.
Yeah, right. So the Grand Forks Herald won a Pulitzer for their coverage because they kept on running while the flood was happening. They had some excellent coverage, and the most famous headline to come from it was it Hell and High Water?
Yes.
I think is what the headline was. And it was a picture of the Grand Forks Herald building burning down in the middle of the floodwaters. So there's a downtown fire that right over flooded down to the extent that you can call it downtown, right over the flooded downtown area. It was the security building, but which was connected to the then Herald building. Yeah, it was stunning.
You know what's awful is I actually just looked up the date, and that was like 21 years ago, like this week. So that's
this week because mandatory evacuation day was like the 17th, right?
Yeah. So, and that's the only time I ever remember spring being canceled was we were too busy to pay attention to the fact that spring had happened. So by the time, because by the time that everyone was allowed back into town, it was like May. It was like, oh, hey, summer's here, and school had already been canceled. So
yeah, school had just been canceled for the rest of the year. Which, by the way, so for us, that meant so in the elementary school system that we were in, and the school system in general that we were in, you had the third graders had a big musical and sixth graders had a big musical, and I was in third grade, so our musical was canceled, and our music teacher was like very sad that we wouldn't have the opportunity. And then our sixth grade moved to middle school. They just moved sixth grade, so we never actually had that big musical. And our music teacher, Mrs. Winger, threw the biggest fit. She was amazing. I love her. Maybe like my favorite or second favorite teacher from elementary school. Through like the biggest fit and ended up forcing the school's hand and creating like the super mega fifth grade musical. So I mean, aside, I just remember that really well.
So yeah, as I said, that's the only time I ever remember spring not happening. But I'm confident that spring happened elsewhere. It just didn't happen in the North Dakota region that particular year. It's very, very wet.
Wet's one word for it, yeah.
Yeah, that's 54 feet of all sorts of fun. I like the fact that you had a song from Keep the Faith in your head, of all frickin' things.
We had to sing it in the fifth grade musical.
They actually, so last year was the 20-year anniversary, and they went and they put it on again to sold out houses.
You're kidding.
They put it on for the 20-year anniversary, and the kids who were performing in it had no memory of the flood because they weren't alive for it. So they were singing.
It's a 20-year anniversary. Of course they were.
Yeah. So these kids are like 15, 16. No memory of something that happened 20 years ago. But the community showed up and sold out every single show, and I did not attend. I didn't like the.
I wish I had known about it. I would have made a 4-hour drive. Yeah. Oh my God.
I did not attend. I didn't necessarily. I watched it the first time. I didn't need to see it 20 years later. And some of the lines apparently didn't land as hard as they did back 20 years ago, but apparently it was partially rewritten to make it to kind of update things a bit. But yeah,
hashtag. I hope it was hashtag problematic. That'd be hilarious.
Yeah. Final question is from Hayden, who asks: you can deactivate either Don from Ohio or the Ben Natan's Twitter account. Who do you pick and why?
So this one's tough, right? Because Ben keeps on talking about the Eagles for some weird reason.
Yeah.
And that's obnoxious. So that needs to go. But Don is his own brand of obnoxious and annoying, and also as a person needs to go. Yeah, this is tough. I tend to agree with a lot of the political takes that they put out there, but I align more closely with Ben. So his tweets are a little bit closer. And so that brings, I think, a little bit more into my Twitter timeline. I'm going to go with deactivate Don just because it's funnier.
See, the amount of smug emanating from the Ben Natan's Twitter feed has just been thick. Like
it's enormous, but at least
thick and rich, and you could drizzle it on pancakes.
Patriots, and not just talking about how the Eagles finally won a Super Bowl, which I totally understand, but like, screw you guys.
Just like he hasn't gone the full like tweeting Vikings people about the score of the NFC Championship game. He hasn't gone that far, but yeah.
I think it's only because of my friendship with him that he hasn't. I think it's the only reason.
You're the one person holding him back from just
exactly.
Ugh.
Yeah, it's not great.
No, this is this is not pleasant either way. So that is going to be it for this episode. Arif, you've been doing quite a lot of writing. Do you have anything else to plug for us?
So we've got this draft guide that we've put together over at zonecoverage.com that includes, so I think last year a lot of people saw my productivity and athleticism scores for each position, and they really enjoyed it. I just got a tweet about it actually asking if I was going to do that again, and the answer is I kind of already have. It's not all in one article, but we've got the top 40 players as well as players at key positions for the Vikings that they might target based on the round that they're expected to go in. We've got production and athleticism scores for all of them. And you can look up those players. We've got 2 minute to 5 minute videos that Luke's done outlining the strengths and weaknesses of those players. We've got really great reviews essentially of who the player is, like as a person from Sam, small write-ups for each of those players. We've got an athleticism web that tells you based on weight adjusted athleticism how they did in each of the drills, which I think is a lot better than saying, they ran a 4.54 and the average at this position is, 4.55. So they did slightly better than average because, if you're a 173 pound receiver, that's like bad. So we've got weight adjusted athleticism scores and we're going to continue putting out more content. Luke and I have done videos for all the Vikings needs, as well as those targets that I mentioned earlier. In order to access that, we ask for a subscription. It's $2.99 a month. That gets you access not only to the draft guide, but to the training camp guide that I put out every year. And so that's like 60 to 100,000 words. It's somewhere, and I think it's actually closer to 100,000 words of Vikings analysis of who's on their roster, what's changed schematically about what they do. There's going to be a huge scouting report on Kirk Cousins in there as well. But yeah, subscription to zonecoverage.com pays my bills, which I need to eat and survive, but also gets you access to a bunch of really great content, and some of the content is up there right now that we're really proud of.
So go ahead and check that out. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and continue to demand excellence. Demand Norse Code. And we'll see you soon.
Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, or wherever else fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, who can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. Our intrepid producer and occasional co-host James Pogachnik can be found on Twitter at Big Mono, or curating the official Norse Code Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. I'm your host with a firm grasp of the obvious, Dusty O'Connell, and my name is my handle on Twitter. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, your one-time donation can be made at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Please visit our website, norsecodepodcast.com, where you'll find links to our Facebook and YouTube pages, along with the episode archive and some other good stuff. And any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be emailed to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. And on behalf of the entire Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.